Sure. You mentioned the partition of Kosovo that was discussed in the 1990s.
Yeah.
Do you think that is possibly the bottom line, especially now linking that to Ukraine? Some of us think that the reason why the globalist elites, let's say, would be interested in starting another conflict in the Balkans is precisely because Ukraine is not going well. It's not going well for them. And the Balkans are always ripe for some of these sinister games. But partitioning Kosovo, Serbs will not accept that, especially Serbian Orthodox Church, that in fact owns much of the territory of Kosovo, has monasteries and churches there that have stood there for centuries. What would be the bottom line? And then you link that to Ukraine. Obviously, that may be another partition. And there have been a lot of conversations about the double standards between Kosovo and Crimea, for example. We're screaming about sovereignty of Ukrainian borders. Why wasn't anybody screaming about sovereignty of Serbian borders?
Well, I think I've already answered why no one is screaming about the Serbian sovereignty in any form. That's because the Clinton administration developed this visceral dislike of the Serbs and decided to demonize the Serbs. What happens in Kosovo is really an extension of what began in Bosnia. I mean, we could go back over that history. That would take us some time to cover all the details, but I was party to that. I watched it. And even though people at the time in Bosnia looked at Tudjman and weren't terribly impressed with him, and many of them did not necessarily like Mr. Izetbegovic, for various reasons, Izetbegovic was given a pass. And there are still people in Washington who are strongly aligned with Bosnia and Kosovo. And at the same time, Tudjman was hammered in the line at the time by Kohl, who was the chancellor of Germany.
Mm-hmm.
So then, we tried to get the Russians to quote unquote hammer the Serbs into line. Well, that didn't work terribly well. And when it came to Kosovo, it was under great pressure and difficulties at home, frankly, that the Russians had at the time in 1999, that they finally pulled out from under Milosevic and left him hanging during the air campaign. I mean, I think the bottom line is as follows. If you go back over the last 500 years of European history, one of two things happens. A division of territory is arrived at by someone in power. In other words, the various representatives sit down and say, all right, if we don't come up with a partition of some kind, we're going to have another war. And several people would sit around the table. And I'm talking about going back to Metternich and Bismarck and Disraeli, all those people.
Sure.
Look, this is not a permanent solution, this partition, but it's the best that we can do right now, and it'll buy us some time. The Congress of Vienna bought time for Europeans. It was not popular with many, many people. You go back and remember that while the Europeans were dividing up things, the great powers, the Serbs were still fighting the Turks. And, no one paid any attention to the skull towers of Niš.
Yes.
I mean, they didn't. People knew about it, but people said, look, we can't take that on right now. Subsequently, it changes. It takes time. And so I think there may be a willingness to look at some solution that is imperfect for the reasons that you just outlined, and that may result in a partition of some kind, and then guarantees that the property that belongs to the Orthodox Christian Church will not be harmed, will not be desecrated, and will be treated as what it should be, as essentially international monuments to history. I mean, some of those I've been in Kosovo, in some of those churches, and they go back to the 8th century and earlier. Mm-hmm. So I mean, this is the beginnings of what we think of today in the world of Christianity. I think that could be done. But what I'm trying to say is that may present itself. There may be an appetite for that, a willingness to do that. The Serb leadership then has to think through, this is not everything we want. We're only going to get 75% of what we want. We're not going to get the other 25%. Or we're only going to get 70, not the other 30. Well, do you accept that on the understanding that at some future point in time there may be an opportunity to revisit it? Or do you refuse it? And I don't know what the right answer is. This is something that has to be carefully considered by the Serbs. War is not a pleasant experience, and everyone in Yugoslavia knows that. Everyone went through hell back in the 90s.
Sure.
They need to recall that. And then you have us. we got involved in a big way. We were talking earlier about these B-1B bombers flying over Bosnia.
Yes.
Essentially some sort of signal to the Serbian state that we're still here and we can still bomb you, which I think is appalling, because most of us at the time thought that was a disgrace anyway. I mean, I've talked before about that.
Sure.
I didn't know very many people in Europe that thought that, NATO existed to create a new war in Europe, which is ultimately what we did. So the bottom line is there are no perfect solutions right now. There may be an interim one, and everyone needs to look carefully at that. And our friend that's sitting in Pristina, who feels that he has a lot of wind behind him, may discover that in a couple of years that wind is completely gone, and no one is going to particularly give a damn anymore about what he does or doesn't want. And by the way, there are lots of people who notice lots of weapons that have been shipped to Ukraine that show up in Kosovo and then are moved elsewhere into the hands of people that we in the West would not want to arm. So again, he's got to rethink what he's doing. Right now he's got backing. There's no question about it. That may not last, but he doesn't necessarily have the backing that he wants for a military confrontation, because everyone's eyes on that point are fixed on Ukraine.
Interesting. And you served under President Trump, and we all remember that botched pull out from Afghanistan during the Biden administration now. Many people make similar comments. Wait until the Americans leave Kosovo, and at some point that will come to an end. We simply, as Americans, cannot sustain this anymore. The Kosovars may find themselves in a really tricky situation, including our friend Albin Kurti.
Yeah.
Anyways, wanted to move to Ukraine, and overnight, I believe, or yesterday, Kakhovskaya Dam on Dnipro was taken out, or portion of that dam. What do you make of it? Who did it? Who benefits?
Well, there are several stories right now. The Ukrainians, of course, have said, the Russians did this. And there's not much reason to believe that, because the Russians could have done it a long time ago, didn't want to do it, because it turns a great deal of the area in Kherson into marsh. It's not beneficial. And remember, the Russians have always conducted operations with a view to what things look like when they end. That's something we never consider very carefully, but the Russians have looked at that. So they have been trying to avoid what they would call unnecessary collateral damage. Where it's unavoidable, they'll do it, but that was never really in the plan. The Ukrainians are accused by the Russians of doing it. Sure. Well, if that's true, the effects are as follows. You end up with a portion of the Russian defense flooded on the east side of the Dnieper River. There's no question about that. Does that help Ukraine? Well, if you're looking at the length of the defensive line that the Russians have built, which was almost 900 miles, that shortens that line a little bit. But when you start shortening the defensive line, that doesn't favor the Ukrainians. In other words, that reduces the amount of territory to which the Russians need to respond in the event of a Ukrainian attack. Then there's a third story, and the third story is that one of the turbines inside the dam's operation blew up. And that comes from someone on the ground who is a Russian who is apparently familiar with the dam. And if that's true, then the whole thing was probably accidental. But again, if it's accidental, it really doesn't help Ukraine at all. It makes it tougher for them to do their job. But the Russians probably do benefit since they have less to defend now. Not that I think the Russians are in any danger. And if you go back and look at what happened over the last 3 days, we've had these so-called probing attacks from the Ukrainian side. Almost 4,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been lost, 54 tanks, 140 armored fighting vehicles, numerous trucks, 2 helicopters, several Ukrainian aircraft. So these probing attacks into Russian defenses were disasters. Russian losses are almost negligible to the point of irrelevant. So bottom line is, at this stage, I wouldn't attach too much significance to it, except to look at it as probably reducing options for the Ukrainians, not improving them.